Hi, everyone. Welcome to the a16z podcast. I'm Sonal, and I'm here today with two special guests, and we are going to be talking about technology and policy. And joining us for that discussion are Julie Samuels, who is the executive director of Engine, a nonprofit advocacy and research that supports the work of startups, and Mike Masnick, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of really popular tech policy and beyond site Techdirt, as well as the president of the Copia Institute, sort of a think tank focused on policy and technology. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So we thought we'd do just sort of a whirlwind tour through all kinds of tech and policy issues because we only have like a limited amount of time. So let's just go through a bunch of them. And the reason we'd like to do this is because, I feel like we sometimes have specific things dedicated to just one topic, but we have here two people who have been immersed on these issues across the board. And so I can't think of any two people I'm more interested in sharing this podcast with to talk about all these topics. And I guess the first question, just to kick things off, because it's really a conversation between you guys, is what's happening now? Like, why now? Like, Mike, you founded Techdirt 20 years ago. And Julie, like, Engine I know has been around, but you went there for a specific reason. Like, what's happening to bring all this stuff on? Like, is this new?
I don't think it's that it's new. I think it's that a couple things. Number one, tech companies are getting a lot bigger. So they're not flying under the radar of government anymore.
Oh, that's
because
huge.
They're getting bigger, right? And number two, government is paying attention to tech companies. So those aren't actually two separate things. It's two sides of the same coin. But this is trite, but in a lot of ways, every company is a tech company and everyone uses tech. And so policy, regulation, legislation, like all of these things are unavoidable.
Yeah, and I think that second point is the key one, which is that everything is tech now. And so the idea that, and that goes both ways, right? So everything that's being regulated in some ways touches on technology, and everything that technology is doing is touching on all different areas of the economy that involve policy. And so the two things are totally connected. And also, to some extent, historically, what people think of as the tech industry or the startup ecosystem or whatever hasn't been all that engaged necessarily on policy issues. And so, historical clashes on policy issues have gone weird. And so I think in the last few years, people have gotten a lot more engaged because it's more important for them to actually really be engaged.
So when you say engaged, like what exactly do you guys mean by engaged? Because I'm seeing all flavors of like straight up fights to actual people having lobbyists to there's a whole range of things. Like what do you guys mean by engaging?
There are all those things. There is the kind of engagement where you have individuals sending emails or tweeting at members of Congress saying, we saw that a lot during SOPA, during net neutrality when the users and the consumers got involved. But you also see
Julie,
companies...
sorry to interrupt you for a second. Do you mind telling our audience just really quickly what SOPA was?
Yeah,
So
of course.
Those not familiar with the acronym?
It was something that both Mike and I worked on. Stop Online Privacy Act. It was a bill from 2010, right? 2010.
2011.
2011. Ostensibly a copyright bill that was kind of put out largely by the content, the movie and the recording industry to under the rubric of stopping a copyright infringement. But what we really thought was it was bad news for the internet. And it was one of the first times that the internet community really coalesced around something and stopped it. You might remember an internet blackout day, January 2011. And that was a really important moment for this industry and for this community. And then we had the net neutrality fight earlier this year. But again, it was a time when when individuals, 4 million individuals, reached out to make their voice heard on that. So that's one level of involvement, right? But of course, you also have hiring lobbyists. Like you said, a lot of companies are now opening offices, government affairs offices where they do their own lobbying. You have a lot of individuals in our community giving heavily to candidates. That's another way of involvement. And we're just becoming more integrated with this process. And that's fairly new.
So that's one of the things that you say is changing because what you just described, all those toolkits, like being able to, do email campaigns, motivate people, grassroots efforts, organize, these are things that have been forms that have been around forever. But like, how has that changed? Because I know you were mentioning that some of this has been changing over time.
One of the things that was different about sort of these two campaigns in particular was that these were, generally speaking, these were the kinds of issues that historically the public didn't weigh in on. These were issues that were heavily lobbied, and whatever decisions were made by big corporate interests and their lobbyists. And in both of these cases, you had real, public activism, getting people to get engaged and to speak out and to do things on their websites or to get others engaged, which I think was actually a really important part of it, that it wasn't just about speaking out to, emailing or calling DC, but it was often using the tools that people had within the tech industry themselves to engage their users and engage others and get them involved. And you had this point where you had two things that basically, if you had asked anyone who was sort of deeply engaged on these issues, if you'd asked us beforehand if there was any chance to stop something like SOPA or to stop bad net neutrality rules, it seemed unlikely. Because these were the things that you didn't stop, because you had really, really powerful interests with strong lobbyists on one side. And yet, because enough people were able to get engaged and speak out, it really did change things in a way that was different than before, and that didn't involve, just like two giant industries lobbying up against each other, but actually real people engaging.
I think that's another interesting evolution, actually, because you're also describing more people getting involved because of the forms of engagement available to them. But there's also this reality, as what you guys are saying, about tech permeating everything now, or everything is a tech company.
Yep.
I don't think that's a trite statement at all, Julie, because I think that's actually very true. And because of that...
Just wait until your toaster tells you to contact your congressman. Yeah.
But I think the point is that the products are touching our lives every day. And I think it's actually harder for companies who are more B2B and whose products do not touch everyone's lives every day.
That's exactly right. You are talking about people who are internet users. We actually recently, I live in New York now, and recently there was a bill that the Mayor de Blasio was pushing that had to do with Uber and other ride-sharing companies. And I'm sure a lot of listeners might have followed that. But essentially what we saw happen was people I think they felt like their Uber was being threatened. So they got involved, right? The same thing with net neutrality, with SOPA. People use the internet every day. They felt like their internet was being threatened. They got involved a lot more so than they do with some other political issues that you might follow that don't really touch what we think of as traditional tech. So I think this stuff that's kind of consumer and user facing really resonates with folks.
And even the business to business stuff actually can resonate, perhaps not as strongly, not in the way that you're going to get as big a response, but like, for example, there was a fight not too long ago, which I think just got settled. Actually, I think I got an email like a couple hours ago between Zenefits and ADP, where they got into a big dispute over payroll issues, which again, this is not a consumer issue. It's very much a business to business issue, but it was another situation where it was definitely sort of an old line business upset about the way in which a newer startup was competing and went to court over it. And it was a mess, but it got a lot of news, and that wasn't a case necessarily where people were protesting. But if you get enough media coverage, things will happen. And actually, with Zenefits, they had a similar thing. That they just had this dispute with ADP, but before that, they had a dispute with the state of Utah.
That's right. We actually covered that in the a16z podcast. One of the things that Parker said that I thought was fascinating is that they had originally gone in trying to do demos of their technology.
Yep.
And it was a big mindset shift for them to realize that you actually have to tell the broader story, the context in which this is all playing out.
I think these things are actually really important for the entire community. When you see those kinds of battles with Zenefits in Utah, and Zenefits ultimately prevailed, it was great. But when you see also Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, and these stories are in the news, you're also reminding people how regulation, how government plays, right? So people are paying attention to policy in a way they haven't before, because these companies have no choice but to engage with policymakers, and it's making news every day.
I mean, one of the interesting aspects of that is I think that a lot of people, perhaps for very good reasons, were very, very cynical about the political process for many years, because it was, their ability to impact it was basically nil. And yet in the last few years, we've seen so many of these examples where speaking out and actually getting engaged has made a difference, that I'm hoping that it actually takes away some of the cynicism towards policymaking and what goes into it, and the ability of, everyday people to actually have an impact on what happens.
Well, don't you think that's been the case so far? I think that's actually playing out.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's still a fair amount of cynicism, but I do think that people are now much more willing to believe that they can make a difference.
That's actually one of the things that I loved about what Ted said about regulatory capture, because my original impression of the phrase regulatory capture was that it's all about rent extraction. And it's just like, but what I realized, what he described was something softer, that it's about familiarity with the processes, the hallways, how things work, getting people to understand, what's at stake and the relationships and sort of how to navigate that. And you're describing like a lot more avenues for people to start like communicating with those players.
Which that's a really interesting point. This is something I engage in DC with policymakers a lot. This is something I spend a lot of time thinking about. I don't have the right answer, but imagine a spectrum, right? And at one end of the spectrum, you have industries who've been engaging in DC with policymakers and state capitals forever, right? Totally entrenched interests, telecompanies, telcos, pharmaceutical industry. They've been there for a bazillion years. At the other end of the spectrum, I think you see these kind of quote unquote stereotypical tech companies, startups, and they're like, we don't need to engage at all. We're going to build our thing and it's going to change the world. And I don't think either of those paths is the path of the future. I think that there's something in the middle, and we haven't quite figured out what it is, but there's something in the middle where people are going to feel comfortable and feel productive and be able to engage because they know the way the world works. And, if anyone's got ideas, let me know.
Yeah,
where that is.
Yeah, no, and I agree totally. I think, one of the things, if it turns out that the tech industry, that the answer for them on policy questions is to build up a giant lobbying setup and apparatus in the nature of like the telcos and the pharmaceuticals and a number of other industries, then I think the tech industry has failed.
Why do you say failed?
Because this is an industry of folks who are super innovative and always thinking through new and creative solutions, and the ability to use communication tools in new and interesting ways, and to gather people and to build communities and to make an impact in all different fields, to then go into the political and policymaking process and to go back to the old, tired, broken way of doing things, which is this, this lobbying setup. That would be a failure. There's no reason why that should be the answer to what this industry does when it comes to actually influencing policymaking. That's not to say that there should be no lobbyists and there should be no understanding of what happens in DC, or that it should be totally ignored. That's not what I'm saying. But I agree with Julie that there's a different way to do things, and it's about actually engaging people on the issues as opposed to just like knowing which strings to pull and who to give the most money to.
I actually agree with that. I think we're all saying the same thing, because I think that we agree that there's a middle way, a third way. We agree that there's, it would be a failure to only reinforce an existing system. But at the same time, there has to be a little mutual give and take. And I think that in that context, it is important to think about engaging in new and different ways.
Yeah.
I totally agree. That's real. I mean, that part's one of the hardest parts. It's saying to people that, there's a game that's played and you have to play some version of it, but it's going to be a better, newer version. And that's really hard it's really hard to get your head around.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and it's a game that you're changing the rules as you go along. I mean, it's not like it's easy to do that.
As we talk about, and I think we'll get into some of these specific issues that are kind of bouncing around right now. I think people will understand there have been some victories, there have been some losses. And as you take a step back and think about those things, you can kind of start to create a framework to understand what's working and what isn't and why.
This is definitely a lot of the way that we have been thinking about things in terms of how we've been setting up Copia, which is very much about, how do we search for ways to help, entrepreneurs and the tech industry be innovative in how they deal with policymakers. And that isn't about like, telling them that you have to go lobby this person or whatever, but actually to work together to come up with interesting and unique solutions that actually, that engage their innovative brains, and ideas, and let them do what they do best, which is innovate, as opposed to just, having to convince, however many members of Congress to do X or Y. That's not a process that's exciting. Actually coming up with something innovative that is a real solution to things.
And let me kind of pile on there for a second. There's something that I think is really interesting and exciting about this community, and that when we talk about politics in particular, and it's that this community is not kind of wedded to traditional political parties in the way that a lot of people are. Like, I really believe that most people you meet in this tech community, particularly in the startup community, are looking for the best ideas from the best candidate, from the best policymaker, whomever. And they don't care if that person is a Republican or a Democrat. They probably prefer that person were an independent, if that's possible.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, when you look at most of these debates, right, they haven't fallen along traditional party lines, and that's actually been so good because, you know, for the most part, the debates are much more on the issues, much more about substance. You know, when they start to get partisan, they start to get silly, and you just get all these, you know, ridiculous things being thrown about. I think that's much more useful. And again, it just fits with exactly what Julie was saying, which is that these aren't, you know, traditional fights.
Right.
And that actually allows for more innovation in terms of how, you know, how they're dealt with.
And frankly, for those of us who work in this space, it's a lot more fun.
So actually, then let's switch gears and let's do a set of lightning rounds around all the issues that we think are kind of interesting and top of mind. And let's talk about patents, because that is just, you know, let's just start there, because that's actually, the three of us came together at the patent conference a few years ago. And that was a lot of fun. I remember Richard Stallman standing up in the back of the room, like he always does at one of these events, and sort of making a statement. But anyway.
Well, I remember him walking through the audience yelling at people.
Oh, right. Okay. You remember it differently. I'm actually glad you remember it better than I do. I've probably blocked it out. If you could just quickly distill what you think the major issue is as it applies to software.
This one is near and dear to my heart. I think that if you were to distill the problem in kind of a couple sentences, it's that we have a one-size-fits-all system. So we treat patents in the pharmaceutical industry the same as in the software industry, and that ends up making no sense. Economically, it doesn't make sense. Conceptually, it doesn't make sense. I can talk a lot about this. I'm not going to do it in a lightning round. But what that has kind of created is that we've got a system that works pretty well for pharma and doesn't work well at all for software.
And why doesn't it work well for software? Like, how would you distill that?
Well, so number one, a patent covers 20 years. And for most of the people listening, I think they'd understand that talking about 20 years of exclusivity for a software invention is crazy, right? The average smartphone is covered by 250,000 patents. The average drug by 30 or 40 patents. So when you start,
that's a big number. That's a big difference,
right? Digging through what we're talking about here. So what that's led to is people who abuse the system, which is, you know, I'm making air quotes here, a pretty big patent troll problem. They go after big tech companies and no one really cares because that is just, you know, not all that interesting. But they started going after small companies, startups, individuals, and we had a big patent troll problem. So that's kind of where we are. Congress has been dealing with this for some time, but we've kind of ended up in a traditional pharma versus tech loggerhead. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of created a situation where things have slowed down on Capitol Hill. We can't, I shouldn't say we can't. I should say we've had a hard time coming up with a political solution.
Yeah, it's a little bit stagnated. And so I'm going to argue against that a little bit, which is that, like, I agree that software patents are a complete disaster and a complete mess, and need to be fixed. And the one other element that I'd add to it beyond the 20-year thing is you know, talk to any engineer and show them a patent and ask them what it's about, and they won't even be able to tell you because the patents are written by lawyers, not by engineers, and it's just junk. It's got nothing to do with what the actual innovation is. And so you have this very broad language. But I'm going to take it a step further and say that, you know, I actually am not convinced that patents work in other industries all that well either. I think it's much more pronounced in the software industry and in the internet industry because of, you know, how many patents there are and how many patent fights there are. I think I'm not going to go all the way down into why I think they don't necessarily work in pharmaceuticals either. But I think that, you know, based on that, I'd love to see a solution that really gets to the heart of the problem with the overall patent system, which is around looking at what is and what is not considered obvious, and whether or not you can allow something such as independent invention. I think you would wipe out so many of the problems of the patent system if you had a real independent invention defense, which is that if if you're just tinkering in your garage and you come up with something, you had no idea that some weird, vague patent existed from, you know, 15 years ago that somebody's going to sue you over, you should be able to go in and say, look, I didn't copy this. I had no idea that this weird patent existed.
Right. You came across it because you just did it.
Right. I had an idea to innovate. This guy sitting on a patent who hasn't done anything, I've actually built something,
Right. It's actually similar to startups because one quick thing there is like when you think about people doing prior art searches before they even start inventing or creating something, I'm thinking now about a startup who has a great idea thinking, oh my God, well, this has all been done before, so forget it. I'm not going to do anything. And the best companies were actually started in spaces where it was very crowded.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And that's...
Well, this is, I love this conversation because I also want to talk about this. This is relevant to copyright too. What we're really talking about is how, as a society and as an economy, we incentivize innovation, right? And and how we do that is really hard. And I shouldn't say it's not really hard to incentivize innovation. How we kind of measure that is really hard. I think that by default, the White House does this. Everyone does this. We say we are an innovative nation and we can prove it because we have X number of patents. And
every company does that too, like
totally.
IBM, Xerox.
I've talked about this a whole bunch. That we have something that you can count, and therefore it becomes inevitable that becomes a metric. And the best example as to how ridiculous that is that go look at China. Right, China has been ramping up the number of patents that they've been filing, like crazy, and so there have been some who've taken that number and said like, oh, look, now China is being super innovative. And I'm not saying they're not being super innovative, but then you start looking at those patents. And for a while, and this may still be the case, like China was incentivizing people in their prisons that they would give them shorter prison sentences if they were able to file patents. So it's just all this numbers thing. And then you look at like all of the big patent lawsuits in China, which, for years, the U.S. especially has been pushing for like, we have to get China to respect patent laws because they're copying everything. So they have to respect patent laws. And so China's like, okay, we'll do that and we'll ramp up our patent enforcement and our patent laws. And then you look at all the cases, and every single patent case in China has been a Chinese firm against a foreign firm, and guess who always wins? And so China has realized that patents are a form of protectionism, and it's a neat form of protectionism for China because they can use that to block competition from foreign firms while pretending that they're doing exactly what the U.S. has been asking them for. It's just, one of many examples of how patents and intellectual property can be used for protectionism, and where the sheer numbers in terms of number of patents that you get is not just a meaningless number, but it's a misleading number.
I think it's actually led to a really dangerous culture in the Valley and in tech companies in general, where there's this pressure to get as many patents as possible, as quickly as possible. And then what you end up with is a bunch of really crappy patents, and those patents end up in the hands of bad actors, and that's how you have a system that's been exploited. And I don't know how to fix that culture. That, to me, is kind of the core of the problem.
I actually don't even know if I agree, Julie, that that's a culture, because I actually think a lot of the engineers and computer scientists that are coming out of universities these days don't kind of really give a shit about patents. And they're just fine with kind of doing their own thing.
So there's two issues. One is that you have lawyers who tell you that you absolutely have to get patents. Right. And then, you have some venture capitalists who also tell startup entrepreneurs that is, one of the first things you have to do. And if you're showing up at a meeting, you have to have patents. And there are some, venture capitalists who I think are more enlightened on that than others. But, for plenty of entrepreneurs, you hear them say like, well, when I go and get an investment, the first thing that I'm asked about is, whether or not I have a patent on it.
I think the origin of that is about the moats for your business and being able to protect it. And the reality is that for a lot of software businesses, you can build a moat through other methods like network effects.
Oh, that's so much more important as network effects.
The first thing you should be doing is making sure that you have an audience and a market and focusing on that. And the moats come naturally with all of those things.
Right. Well, that's network effects because it's more valuable for more people, the service, because you're building a damn good service that people want to stick around.
The only thing that patents really do is protect you on the downside. And if you're protecting on the downside at the beginning, I think you've just done something wrong.
I'm glad to hear you guys talk about this because you're taking actually much more nuanced approach than I had envisioned, because I actually do believe, having edited those freaking 35 op-eds, or maybe it was 40, I don't even remember, but oh my God, that it's a very nuanced and complex topic. Agreed. It is a problem. But I also think it's completely unfair for other players who sometimes say ban all patents, because I actually think they can be very useful in other scenarios. And there's a lot of alternative arrangements as well.
I don't think either of us would say blow up the entire patent system. I would say, but I actually, as someone who is a patent lawyer as well, I actually think we are doing a disservice to the system by allowing it to continue in this broken fashion instead of really protecting. Again, we need to like take a step back, think about what it is we're trying to incentivize here as a society, think about what it is we're trying to create. And if we have a better tailored system to do that, it will also actually serve that system. And we're not doing that right now.
Yeah, totally. And I would say, I mean, I might feel pretty strongly that no patent system would probably be better than the patent system that we have today, but that doesn't mean that no patent system is the ideal situation. But I think that, you know, what we have today is totally broken. And as Julie said, I mean, it leads to just no respect at all for the patent system because it doesn't deserve any.
There are other ways to incentivize innovation.
Many
we
other
talked
ways.
about things like network effects, but there are other pieces too, like government sponsoring R&D, prizes, awards. There are other things we can decide to do as a society that will push people to create and build things.
And just I mean, you know, taking a step back, right? I mean, the thing that incentivizes most people to create stuff is not patents. It's usually either that they have a personal need themselves and realize like this would be useful, I can make it for myself, and therefore I can also